ambiguity and complexity have learned to ask questions, especially questions about context. So they will ask the investor things like, well, tell me a little bit more about the institution you represent. And some of the most powerful questions are about goals, like what are you trying to accomplish? And what other sorts of investments do you have? And how much risk are you willing to take? And so on. Gradually, they begin to narrow things down and they reduce the ambiguity through this systematic approach of asking questions. So that's another thing that I looked for in these people that I was going to put forward to be hired. Now, a third thing has to do with the structure of the problem. So you give them a problem, can they analyze it? And can they figure out, do they ask questions like, what is the structure of the problem? So take, for example, the problem that Barack Obama faced when he came into the White House. He knew that healthcare was an issue and he had promised to do something about it. So what's the structure of the problem when it comes to improving the US healthcare system? Well, you have to ask questions like, well, who are the stakeholders? Who's involved? And if you think about it conceptually, you have the users of the service, the consumers. You have the providers, like the doctors. You have the people who pay for the service, mostly the insurance companies, sometimes the government. And it's a little different than some other kinds of services because most services, the consumer is the one who pays for it. But healthcare is this funny kind of thing where the consumer and the payer are not necessarily the same. And then you have insurance companies, which are one of the payers. And you have the public at large. We're seeing this today with COVID. So if someone chooses not to get their COVID shot, it's not just a personal decision. It also matters to the person that they cough on, or if they choose not to wear their mask. So society at large has an issue. So that's what I mean by the structure of the problem. And then along with this, you ask yourself, well, what are the relevant factors or variables here? So in healthcare, what's the quality of care? What is the access to care? Things like that. What is the average lifespan, or what is infant mortality? These are variables that you can measure like a scientist. The fourth construct had to do with consequences. If you're making decisions or trying to solve tough problems, you have to think about what are the consequences of the various choices of action you have. And people differ in the extent to which they're able to do this. If you're assessing candidates, you might want to know to what degree can they anticipate not just the first order or primary consequences of something, but also the second order, third order, higher order consequences. And consequences can be positive or negative. And sometimes you might have primary consequences that are positive and secondary ones that are negative. So if I eat a delicious piece of pie, the primary consequence might be that I feel terrific and I'm happy. Secondary consequences, the scale goes up tomorrow, right? So that's the negative one. Likewise, if I go to the gym and work out, I may feel pain today, but I'll get the gain eventually. So there are trade-offs sometimes between these positive and negative consequences. When I think about these, by the way, here's a little note of levity. This cartoon seems to capture it well for me. So this fellow is looking straight ahead and he's ignoring the contextual information available to him. And he's about to learn that if you initiate a process without analyzing the context and the possible outcomes, you risk being hurt by those unanticipated consequences. Anyway, so as I spent day after day assessing candidates and sending them off to the hedge fund, I started to get bored. And I began thinking to myself, if you can assess people using these constructs, maybe you could coach them as well. And so I began to immerse myself in the field of executive coaching. I started going to conferences, and I realized that if you wanted to get anywhere in this field, you had to be certified. So I went to a training program and I got certified. But I didn't really like the training. When I was participating in the training, it had a certain character to it. It seemed to me to be sort of atheoretical. And there was a lot of emphasis on asking what people like to call magical questions. And you know, as scientists, we don't really go in much for magic. And it seemed to me that a lot of the approach was kind of like monkey see, monkey do. So these guru coaches would give demonstrations, and they would ask these supposedly profound questions. And then the students would sort of try to memorize the questions. And then when they would get in front of a client, they would try to think to themselves, what was that brilliant question that I saw the coach do in the demo? And they'd rack their brains and try to come up with this question in real time. And I thought to myself, you know, that doesn't make sense to me. If you have a good theory, you don't need to memorize a bunch of stuff. You can sort of apply the theory, and you can figure out in any given situation what makes sense. So I started saying to myself, what would a scientific approach include? How would it be different from this monkey see, monkey do kind of business that I was observing? So I'd learned enough about marketing that I was able to get some initial clients, and I started working with clients and talked to a mentor that I had back from graduate school who was very smart. And between the two of us, we started to work out some principles. I think many of these were known to him already, but they became clearer to me at least. So the first of these principles was this one. Language is a window to thought. So, you know, unless you're a mind reader, you can't know what's going on in somebody else's head. But if you listen carefully, you can get some clues, and you can get a sense of how clear their thinking is. Not only that, you get lots of other data too. And these data can be useful when you're trying to solve problems, or the client is trying to solve problems and you're trying to help them, or they have important decisions, difficult decisions to make. Maybe they even have mixed feelings about those decisions, which are making it even harder for them to figure out what's the right choice. So the next principle is a kind of expansion on the first one. What does clearly mean? You know, we talk about operational definitions. So from my point of view, clearly had to do with the degree of differentiation and integration. You know, in math, we learned, in calculus, we learned to differentiate and integrate. Likewise, you know, in brain science or cognitive science, if you think about what people do when they're thinking, they tend to be doing one or two things. They tend to be analyzing things, you know, breaking it down into the parts, or they tend to be synthesizing. They put the parts back together, or they're integrating. And you can get clues to this from the language that they use. So here's what I mean by undifferentiated language. Somebody says, my boss is a jerk. Or you say, how was the movie? They say it was interesting. They say, how do you feel? They say, I feel overwhelmed. These are big, fat, undifferentiated words. Now, if I go grocery shopping and my wife asks me what I bought, maybe I can differentiate. Maybe I say, I bought apples, I bought milk, I bought oranges, I bought cottage cheese, I bought pears. That's a pretty well differentiated list. Integration is different. It has to do with putting things together in categories. So how would I integrate this list? Well, I might say I got some fruit, right? You know, the apples, oranges, and pears are the fruit, and I got some dairy. I went to the dairy section. I got some milk and cottage cheese. So it's as simple as that. So when you hear people's language, you can ask yourself, you know, how well differentiated is it? And if it's not that well differentiated, you might help them out, or you might help yourself out. You might produce more information by asking a differentiating question, because questions can clarify thinking. So you might say, oh, your boss is a jerk, huh? In what way? Or the movie was interesting. In what way? How so? You know, whatever. Likewise, if you want to help somebody integrate, here's an example of an integrating question. You don't have to memorize these. If you get the concept, you can think of many more. But to integrate, you might say, well, how do you see these things fitting together? So if my wife asked me that, I say, well, I had some fruit, I bought some fruit, and I bought some dairy stuff. Okay. Now, I was talking about how when you listen, you get data. And if you ask a differentiating question, you get even more data. So it's helpful from a scientific point of view to organize your data into categories. So here are some categories that I found helpful in coaching individuals, trying to help them to be more effective in solving problems or making tough decisions. So, and this you'll see kind of relates back to the list of constructs I gave earlier. So the first category that I find helpful to put information into is context. And I divide this into internal and external. By internal context, I mean what's going on inside the person. So, you know, like, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? If I'm if I'm in a negotiation with one other party, their thoughts and feelings are their internal context. The external context is, you know, my company, his company, the business environment, things like that. Who else is concerned about this? The stakeholders, could be the customers, other suppliers, whatever. Now, outcomes is another category. So it's important to know something about people's goals or what they see as the desired outcomes, and likewise, what they want to avoid. If you go back to physics, the positive outcomes, you can think of them as having an attractive effect. The negative outcomes are things you want to avoid. They might have a kind of repulsive effect. In any case, they kind of polarize the field in which you're operating. The third category is implications, and you get information about implications by putting together 1 and 2. If you think about the context and you think about the desired outcomes, it has implications for number 4, the process. In other words, the things that you're going to do and the sequence in which you do them to accomplish whatever the desired outcome is. Now, anyone who's ever been a public speaker knows that unpleasant feelings can make it harder to think clearly. And by unpleasant feelings, I mean things like anger or anxiety or fear or sadness. When people speak in an undifferentiated way, that's a clue that these unpleasant feelings are present. So the coach can ask questions to help clarify. That is to say, to help them differentiate or integrate. And so useful data is the result. But sometimes unpleasant feelings are outside of awareness. So coaches use empathy as a way to bring these unpleasant feelings into awareness. And in so doing, they can reduce the feelings. They can calm the fears or reduce the anger. And by doing that, they help to restore the person's thinking ability. And it could be a statement or a question. So if somebody says, the person says, my boss is a jerk, if you know enough about the context, or if you ask them questions and they clarify something about the context, you might get enough information to say, well, you're angry because your boss gave you a rush project at 4:45 on Friday. And the person says, damn right I am. And then you see them take a deep breath and they begin to calm down a little bit because they feel understood. And what you've done as a coach, a boss or a friend, is to help reduce that anxiety and enable them to think more clearly. And in the process, you've helped to bring those feelings that may have been outside of awareness into sharper focus. Now, I talked earlier about positive and negative outcomes. There are feelings associated with those outcomes. When we think about something good, the anticipation is positive. If there's something terrible we don't want to happen, we fear it. And so imagine someone who's contemplating retirement or selling their business maybe for a nice profit. They're thinking about all the money they're going to have, how they won't have trouble paying their bills anymore, how they'll be able to have more time to play golf. Those are all positive feelings. At the same time, they may be thinking at some level within awareness or perhaps outside of awareness, gee, I'm going to miss those people that I enjoy working with. Or, gee, what's it going to be like to no longer be the captain of the ship, to no longer be seen as the CEO of company X or whatever. So those things represent a loss. This brings us to the next principle, which is when things are far apart, it's hard to combine them or to integrate them. And this applies both to thoughts and to feelings, especially if they're not well differentiated or they're outside of awareness. So coaches can use empathic statements or questions to help somebody put things together. So for example, if we're talking to our friend who says their boss is a jerk, and we get some more information, we may hear about the raise they got last month. So if we want to be empathic and at the same time help them to integrate, we might say, gee, your boss gave you a raise last month. It must be hard to put together the good things about him with the awful things, the annoying things like the project he gave you at 4:45 on a Friday. When you do that, you don't have to do the integration for them. It naturally occurs. And it may occur right in the moment, or it may occur overnight when they think about it. But you've done something very important to help them. Anyway, I've been going on for a long time, so I think I'll kill the share so I can see your faces again and find out how many are still with me and how many have fallen asleep. I wanted to leave plenty of time for question and answer. So for those of
it's
you,
very interesting. It's very interesting, but I'm not sure why.
I have a question for you. Just as
that was a joke, folks. David is playing with me here. David, it was interesting in what way?
Let me consult my notes. I'll get back to you.
Let me ask you something. So I'm trying to picture how do you get a contract, I mean, as an executive coach,
Yes.
right? Are you being hired by the corporation to try to make Johnny a better executive? Or are you approached independently by Johnny because he wants to change his career or whatever?
Yeah, so it can happen in either one of those circumstances. Companies will hire people. Historically, there was a phenomenon where, and this gave coaching a bad name. You'd have an employee who, or let's say a manager who was failing in some way, and you wanted to fire them, and you went to HR and you said, hey, I want to fire this guy, he's failing. And they would say, not so fast. You know, our lawyers tell us that we got to give him a chance. So they would kind of play the 3 strikes and you're out game. You know, they would say, well, we're warning you, you got to clean up your act. And if that didn't do it, they'd warn him again. And the third time they might say, all right, we're going to hire you a coach. And that, as you can imagine, was not the best circumstances for creating a trust-based helping relationship. And coaches got a bad name for that. But things have changed quite a bit. And as with many things, the West Coast leads the East Coast. So if you go to Silicon Valley today, it's really seen as a kind of a badge of honor to have a coach. If you have a coach, it means your company's identified you as a high potential, as someone that they're willing to invest in. And so one of the people I trained with was a guy named David Peterson, who was the head of coaching and executive development at Google. And he had a stable of hot and cold running coaches, both internally trained and also independent contractors who they called external coaches, that they would provide to people. Typically, the lower level people got the internal coaches, and the senior executives would get the external coaches for a variety of reasons. But in other cases, people will hire their own coach. So because I had worked in the hedge fund industry, I tend to get calls from other people who work in and around that industry. And so one time, for example, I got a call from a partner in a top investment management firm. And this is the kind of person who was earning 7 or 8 figures a year. And he was miserable. He hated his job. And he had mixed feelings about leaving because it's hard to leave that kind of money on the table on the one hand, and set out into a situation where things are very uncertain, and you know, you don't know whether it's going to be better or worse than where you are. But at the same time, he was bored stiff, and he could see that the industry was changing and that his company needed to make changes that they weren't prepared to make. And so that frightened him. So he had this jumble of you know, fears and uncertainties on the one hand, and the hope on the other hand that he could do much more interesting, exciting work that he would really enjoy once more. So in that case, the work was to help him to differentiate those feelings. You know, it wasn't very complicated for me, really. I mean, he asked me a lot of questions about my background and so on. He happened to have a PhD in theoretical physics, and the fact that I had been in physics at MIT appealed to him. But the truth is, it really wasn't required to do the job. I mean, it may have been helpful in getting the job, but it wasn't really required. I just said, so look, what don't you like about your job today? And he would say 3 things, and I would say, what else? That's what you call a differentiating question. And after I would say what else a couple times, then I would get fancy and I would say, anything else? And then we'd move on to the next list. Well, what's really, you know, what do you really love about it? Or what's really important to you? Well, I like being around really smart people. I like being on the cutting edge of technology. I like having the budget to buy the latest hardware and software, whatever. And after those three, if you're catching on, you know the next question. What is it?
So the
Somebody help
obvious
me out.
question is, how do you market to the vaccinators?
How do you market to the anti-vaccinators?
Exactly. How do you tell all these people they need to get vaccinated? Because the number in the United States they're getting vaccinated is going down, down, down. My wife has vaccinated 1,500 people, and now she's not even getting called in to vaccinate as a nurse practitioner. So how do you take all the things you're saying? You should be able to say that to the public.
Yes, yes,
You need to get vaccinated, and you can't just like say, yeah, ding, darn, 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 you got to do it.
yes.
There's got to be another message.
Okay, so now we're getting into some really interesting stuff. So thank you, Robin, for taking us from the, I don't know what you call it, prosaic to the profound. This requires a lot of careful thought. So if you take somebody who doesn't want to be vaccinated, let's assume that they've heard the science, that they were brought up in school with, where at some point they had a class where they discussed the germ theory of disease. And if they weren't in a medically induced coma, that, went into their head. And maybe they even heard about how vaccines are created. They might have heard the story of Jonas Salk or whatever, or Fleming discovering penicillin, in 7th grade science class. So the information is in there. And yet, in spite of that, they're deciding not to do this thing. So we can hypothesize that they have mixed feelings, that somewhere deep down, they know that the vaccine could benefit them. But at the same time, there's something that they perceive to be negative about the vaccine. That, in other words, it's associated in their mind with some unpleasant feelings. That if they get the vaccine, it's going to hurt them. Or if they get the vaccine, it's going to mean that they're a liberal Democrat or one of those people. Or if they get the vaccine, they're giving up their freedom or whatever. So there are these two sides that are coexisting, but they're far apart in the mind. And certain things will drive them further and further apart. For example, cult indoctrination is one way in which you get people to think in a very lopsided way. And when I use that phrase, I feel compelled to give an operational definition. So a cult, operationally speaking, is an organization in which people make a psychological bargain where they agree to get a reduction in anxiety in exchange for a reduction in autonomy in thought and action. So they constrain their thinking, they constrain their action to that which is approved by the cult. And by being a member of the cult, they feel good about themselves. They feel a sense of belonging. They feel strong, powerful, free, proud, whatever. And, there are certain things that cults do to encourage this kind of feeling. They have symbols like flags, and they wave them, and they march in lockstep, and they have secret hand gestures and not so secret. There's a lot of things that people do in a cult situation. So I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't want to get the vaccine is part of a cult, but that is one element of what I think is going on. In the milder case where it's just the mixed feelings, I think you can use some of the techniques that I described earlier to help the person integrate the mixed feelings. So in a simple case where we're not dealing,
Right.
what's that?
No, I agree. That's where I was going.
Yeah, you could just say, okay, tell me all the
As a person, an individual, what do we say? You can't just say, you're wrong.
yeah, exactly. If you say you're wrong,
Yeah.
you know what happens. You just polarize.
No,
and
totally.
you provoke the defenses. I mean, remember, I said that unpleasant feelings interfere with the ability to integrate information. So you say to somebody, you're wrong, they typically feel angry or ashamed or whatever. That's not conducive to integrating information. Instead, you might say something like, I'm curious, tell me more. What are all the positive reasons that you see for not getting a vaccine?
Right.
And you listen empathically,
I saw
say,
that Chemical and Engineering News had the same sort of thing as somebody had said. So people don't want to hear you give them information. They want to hear a story.
yes,
You said, my wife is vaccinated. She said, this woman came in and says, well, somebody down the street said that somebody had a bad reaction. And Robin said, well, I had somebody said that the other day and came off and, everything went well, but we don't know how to do that. I mean, us, literally,
yeah.
group here, we're all like, well, you're an idiot. You should let's do facts.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Science, people who are trained as scientists believe in the power of reason. And so our natural impulse is to try to reason people out of it.
Yeah.
But if you think about this, these principles of just what I call disruption, the disruptive effect of anxiety or other unpleasant emotions on people to think in a differentiated way or to integrate, then you realize that what you really need to do is help them to think through all the positive reasons and all the negative reasons. And eventually you say something like, well, how do you add it all up? Because typically they're pushing some of the reasons out of their consciousness. Metaphorically speaking, they're creating distance. The further things are away from each other, the harder it is to combine them. So what you do, again, metaphorically, is you help to bring the two closer together on the stage of their mind. So you put the positives and the negatives together, and you ask a question like, okay, how does this add up to you? Like how many people have died from COVID? How many people have died from the injections? So how do those numbers add up to you? What are they saying? And you just, and you don't even insist that they give you an answer on the spot. Let them go away, and their mind will think about the question overnight.
Can I just interject here? So I'm kind of want to get back to the coaching aspect.
Yeah.
So when you're executive coaching, are you trying to modify somebody's behavior, or what's usually the goal?
Yeah. So the goal is whatever the client says it is. Now, you pointed to something earlier, Bruce, in that if you're hired by the company, you could have mixed motivations. You could have conflicting goals. The company may want this person to remain in their job and work harder and harder or be more and more effective. The person may be miserable, and they may be conflicted about whether they should leave or not. So coaches can get into some challenging situations when they have an assignment like that. Smart coaches will ask a lot of questions about the context up front to try to avoid being inserted into those situations.
I mean, every time I've ever seen you know, consultants coming in to an organization. I remember one time the engineering group didn't have a union at the company.
Yes.
And the union was trying to infiltrate, and everybody wanted to, a whole bunch of people were trying to get this union going.
Yeah.
And of course, the company didn't want them. And suddenly this very personable consultant appears. I mean, he's just so wonderful. He just loved everybody to death and would take them out one at a time and talk to them and everything. And eventually, believe it or not, they actually fired the HR manager at the company and hired a new guy who came in and actually kind of smoothed everything over. The union went away. And then a year later, they closed the operation.
Uh,
That's not a good, that's not a
Yeah,
good
well,
story for you.
remember the definition I said at the beginning. So executive coaching to me is a series of thoughtful conversations aimed at accomplishing some shared goals. The situations you're talking about are not ones in which there are shared goals.
I'm not even sure the consultant knew what was going to happen. You know, those executives were above him were, you know, basically smarter than the rest of us, I guess.
Yeah, well, so there's certain ethical guidelines in coaching, just like in any other profession, and one of the ethical guidelines has to do with confidentiality. So, a coach is not an intelligence gathering agent. It can be seductive to coaches who are vulnerable to this sort of thing, because management can make someone feel important by saying, if you do this, we'll reward you handsomely. I once got a call from a particularly notorious hedge fund. I won't say the name of it. And they wanted me to do a search to find a psychologist to work in-house. Any of you have seen Billions? There's the Wendy Rhodes character on Billions. God knows where they got the idea for that character from. But anyway, they asked me if I could help them find a psychologist. And I said, before I take on this assignment, I have a question. It often comes to pass that employees disclose confidential information to the psychologist. What are your guidelines with respect to that sort of thing? Does management expect the in-house psychologist to share anything that they hear with them? And they didn't like that question. The conversation ended shortly after that, and I didn't get the search.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I was
I'm
happy
sure.
happy not to.
Well, I can tell you for sure, companies get, because I've worked at several companies, and they get very, they have their internal culture, and everybody sees the same people day after day, year after year, and you're not getting any new thinking after a while. It happens even in engineering groups. You need to bring in some fresh ideas.
Yes.
And I especially with managements that have a lot of really power hungry, managers, they like that. They like pulling the strings, and they like to get people to do what they want them to do. And sometimes they actually start becoming become their own worst enemy at some point.
Yes.
And they need somebody to come in there and tell them how people really see them. Because it's a very isolating thing to be a manager when things aren't going well for you.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. There are people who will come in and tell managers how people really see them. But I believe that my role is not to be a message carrier, but rather to be a facilitator of conversations. So if the manager says, I'm having trouble accomplishing my goals, I've got 50% turnover in my department, or people are asleep at their desks, or something like that, I'll say something like, well, gee, I wonder, would it enhance your position in some way to have some information about what people think the issues are in the department? And, you know, I put it in terms of a goal of theirs. You know, an alternative might be to, you know, how about if I come in and find out what your people are saying about you behind your back, or what complaints they have, or what they think the problems are? You know, managers love control. So I try to talk in terms of goals that I expect will be valued by them. So I'll say, would it enhance your position in some way? But then I'll say, well, so let's see, what would it take to create that kind of dialogue?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
say, you know, the answers are not hard. The only thing that stands in the way of coming up with the answer to this, coming up with the obvious question or the obvious answer to the obvious question, is fear. You know, but by saying we're going to enhance your position, you reduce the fear. And they might say, what are you talking about? Creating a process where I can get more information about what they're thinking. You mean like asking them? And you can say, well, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that would be a good start? You know, some coaches will say the best coaches are lazy. You know, it's not rocket science to be a good coach. However, that kind of statement is what I see as the monkey see, monkey do kind of training of coaches. The coaches who say, oh, it's easy, you just be lazy. I don't know what to do with that kind of instruction. I need the principles that I outlined earlier. The question from my point of view is lazy in what way?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a special kind of lazy that's informed by science.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've seen, you know, churches with like ministers and priests and rabbis, you know, they're stuck with the congregation for as long as they can last, basically. And they almost always get ousted in some unpleasant way. And I think so many times that some of that might have been avoidable if they just knew what people were thinking. And maybe it's impossible for, it's like coaches of basketball teams. You know, they can be fantastic, but after 5 or 6 years, most of them, you know, have to move on.
Yeah.
Only a few can stay forever.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes you don't even have to bring the other people into the room physically to have the person hear their voices. Sometimes you can do it metaphorically. You can simply say, listen, preacher or rabbi or priest, if your congregants were sitting here with us, what do you imagine they would say about your sermons? Say, well, I don't know, but I've seen some of them sleeping in the front row. Oh, tell me more. You know, differentiate. You know, what would you infer from that? Implications.
I have a thing that relates to that. I taught for years in a college, and I realized that when new people come in to be teachers in a college, they have no background or training. They are thrown to the wolves. And I would guess that is the same in many types of companies that are hiring executives who really don't know what it means. And perhaps the coaching should be started at that point, or human resources should have a program that brings in the ideas before they fester and become a serious problem. We had so many faculty that had great knowledge, but had no idea how to present it.
Yes.
You know, and then they would be upset when they would see the reviews they would get at the end of the year because we let our students review us.
Yes.
And they would say, why? I taught the material. So
Yeah.
that's an issue that should be looked at by many places, I think.
Yes, and some of the colleges or employers that think they're being progressive will say, we're going to train our new managers, or we're going to train our new faculty. but the training that they provide is it's not heuristic. It's not experience based. It's lecture style training, sort of like the way I started off tonight, which you can imagine how much better it could be if you could do this in a heuristic way where you're helping people to draw out the lessons from their experience. One problem is that it takes longer though to do. But a lot of companies now have soured on classroom training for their new managers or for other purposes, and even some universities and medical schools. For example, I belong to the Institute of Coaching, which is a joint venture between the Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital, and it was founded to help doctors become better in their interactions with their patients. And this was something they certainly weren't learning in medical school. It wasn't part of the curriculum. But
the other thing is that people who are struggling simply may have to recognize that their choice was a bad decision. Some people are not cut out for certain things. When I would teach, I left feeling energized. But when others taught, it drained them. And I would think there's a big difference here.
yes.
They are dragging something out and they're not responding. They aren't even looking at the faces maybe of the students they're teaching. And I think some of them have to be aware of that this may not be for them. It is a skill, just like being a manager is a skill, being a CEO is a skill. And if you don't have it, for whatever reason, it's time to move on.
Yes, well, when I talked about those 4 constructs earlier, those are present in people naturally to greater or lesser degree.
Right.
And some people are not cut out to be theoretical physicists,
Right.
or researchers in a hedge fund, or senior managers. So depending on the role, you need a certain level of the requisite qualities. So coaching is not gonna take someone who lacks all emotional intelligence and turn them into a wonderful people person. But for people who have enough of the requisite qualities, it can certainly help them to make the best use of those qualities, and especially to use those qualities to the fullest of their ability, knowing that that ability varies as a function of their current level of disruption.
Right.
In other words, the present, how much anxiety or fear or sadness or whatever unpleasant feelings they have at that moment.
I found a lot of people, I did a lot with R&D and manufacturing and whatnot. And some people just couldn't stand to have any loose ends.
Yes.
And, and they always wanted to finish everything before it was ready to be finished. It was just, they had to get to the end point every day.
Yes.
And, basically when you're working on a 5-year project, you've got to know that sometimes it's just not ready yet. And you've got to, have the patience. And I've known very smart people that are so bottom line oriented that they couldn't get out of their own way in a design or research setting. But they might be really great if you were doing like testing, where you had to get tests done. Yeah. And you had to write that thing up, or maybe, might be good at accounting, right? Where, you get those tax forms done every year, and you got to do them fast. And there's a lot of very definite rules.
Well, from the point of view of human resources management and creating effective organizations, whether they be universities or engineering departments or whatever, coaching is not the be all and end all. Employee selection is another important factor. So you have to be able to go in and take a look at different roles and kind of operationalize what are the qualities required to perform effectively in that role. And then you have to use that to screen people. And ideally you put in place people who are a relatively good fit. And then you bring in the coaches later to say, okay, given that this person's a pretty good fit, how can we help to optimize their performance in this role?
Well, Paul, this has been great. I think we could go on and on. You know, as we sort of run out of talks, which we may be coming to that point in a few weeks, it might be interesting to have people talk about their careers, you know, sort of from one end to the other. I think it would be interesting to find out, for instance, what Raipu has done, you know, for instance.
I was about to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, what you gave us today, Paul, is a lot of packaged common sense. And it's unfortunate that common sense is not very common.
Right.
I mean, then there won't be need for the coaches. I'll tell you, as someone, you know, I joined this research institute as a postdoctoral fellow. And, you know, I knew what my research topic was and what my project was. But then as career, you advance, then you develop a program, you get more, you hire postdocs, you hire people, you have a team to manage. And those are not necessarily the skills that I learned in classrooms, etc. And yes, the company did help all along the way. They would train, they would have these training, coaching, not a formal necessarily, but a few sessions and some mentors and all kinds of things. The HR would come in, or they would bring in people for, I would see those who are going into the executive branch, they would get these, they would send them out to a course to MIT or to somebody, take a management course or something like that. But there was most of the time when we went into the labs and tried to have something like that, myself included, the response was, this is so commonsensical. Why are we paying this person gobs and gobs of dollars, many more than our salaries, to just tell us this? And then they would kind of put a block in it, not realizing, well, yes, you know the answers. You just haven't put them together yourself.
Right.
And if you did it in the first place, you wouldn't need to.
Yeah, but you know what? It's right. But Paul explains that basically you're bringing the answers out.
Yeah, it's
that are there, except they aren't being exposed without help from the outside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the catalyst role that you have to play.
Yeah.
Yeah. So see, calling something common sense is an example of an undifferentiated statement.
Yeah. Okay.
If I were listening to that person who said, "Oh, this is all just common sense,"
In what way?
my hypothesis would be something about me coming in here and trying to teach this is making this person uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're uncomfortable, I can hear it in their language because they're using undifferentiated terms like common sense. So exactly, I would say, okay, so what are the elements of this? Can you know, if this is common sense, what are the 10 common sense principles here? You know, please articulate them. Can you give me a differentiated list? And you see how quickly the bluster would disappear.
Yeah.
I mean, common sense to a mechanical engineer is not the same as common sense to a, you know, to a physicist, to maybe a theoretical physicist or a nurse. You know, each person has common sense based on their experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. The trade-offs, weighing of the trade-offs. What are the positives? What are the negatives? What aspect of it is it that you like? And, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, analytic geometry and all that sort of stuff, and all these geometrical things is just what I've done for so long that it's common sense. But
there's a difference
David
between,
Dunning, maybe he hasn't, you know, calculated the area under a parabola in his entire life. You know.
there's
Okay.
a difference between calling something common sense which is, you know, a variation on what you might call name calling, and exercising your common sense, which is an example of sort of the automatic application of skills that have become intuitive, you know, that they don't require a lot of conscious effort to apply. So I think engineers have all sorts of common sense about engineering, but if somebody says what you do is just common sense, I think to myself, they're calling me a name. They're trying to disparage what I do because presumably I made them uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think
Well,
that-
I think we probably should end it at this point.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
thank you very much. And I think next week is going to be Mark Ketterer, another psychologist coming up. So it's going to be Psychology Month. All
Well,
right.
thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
It
Okay.
was delightful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good job.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye-bye.